Hello, this is Rich. I'm with Cindy, and we're on Legacy and at toatsea.com. This is episode 10, the final episode in our series about weather planning for passages. We sat in New Caledonia for over 2 months looking for weather to get us comfortably to Gladstone, Australia. We finally took off in what looked like an acceptable window on Thursday, the 4th of August. This video is a post-mortem of that passage. What went right, what went wrong. Hint, we said these fatal words when we chose this passage.
Maybe we should relax our standards.
Let's take a look at the forecast before we left. This is the wind speed, and day 2 it comes up a little bit, but still not very high, and decreases after that, so it should be a pretty light wind passage, or it should have been a pretty light wind passage after the first couple of days. The wave height looked pretty good, with the waves less than 2 meters for the entire trip and getting lower towards the end of the trip. We were happy. The roll was what had us concerned. A good half the trip was above 4 degrees root mean squared roll, and 4 degrees is supposed to be the point where it's difficult to do things. Well, I've never had these kinds of numbers in a forecast before, so it was interesting to see how they really worked out. Everything was pretty much to plan. Inside the lagoon, of course, was very calm and flat. The winds were light throughout the first day, building a little bit the first evening, but everything mostly was as forecast. I asked Cindy to sum up every day in a few words. Her words for Thursday: bumpy and lumpy. Here's what we saw on day 2 when we downloaded the forecast. The wind was supposed to start going much lighter and then only coming up to about 15 knots for the rest of the trip. That had us smiling. The waves had gotten larger than in the forecast the previous day, with them over 2 meters now at points. The roll was about the same, pretty much unchanged. It was still going to be pretty uncomfortable as we rolled more than 4 degrees for the second half of the trip. No improvement there at all. Here's what the seas looked like. We had enough wind that we were able to sail, but it was pretty bumpy. I've never been able to make waves appear as big as they really are on the camera. I did my best here, but still, they were much worse than they looked. This looks like a pleasant day of sailing. We finally started to lose our wind in the evening, and by evening and night we were motoring and rolling around quite a bit. Cindy's words for this day: bumpy and grumpy. And here's what Wednesday, day 3 brought us.
Here we are motor sailing. The wind's 15 knots, but it's almost directly behind us, and the seas are still rolling and choppy enough that if we put up the sails, they just flop around. So the main's up, but reefed, and we're motor sailing.
Unlike a lot of cruisers, we really don't mind motoring. We've motored days at a time and really enjoyed it. It's much preferable to us over the alternative of getting bashed about. The one good day was Cindy's phrase for Saturday. She capped the night off with an amazing picture of bioluminescence. Sunday's forecast was disappointing, with the wind ahead of the beam and getting stronger. The graphs showed that the roll was going to be really uncomfortable almost the entire rest of the trip, and they were right. Here's the spreadsheet that shows the roll as well as the steepness factor. Yuck. The day started out pretty nice, but the winds and the seas gradually built and turned into a very rough night. Cindy's phrase for the day: good day, rough night. Monday, day 5's forecast showed the waves getting bigger and on the beam for the rest of the trip. Again, the video doesn't show it. It looks like we're happily sailing along, but it was pretty bumpy, but it did ease overnight. Cindy's words for the day weren't very creative. Bumpy but easing. Tuesday's forecast was pretty disappointing. It looked like the wind would stay high all the way into port. While the wave height was dropping, the period was also dropping, so the roll would continue pretty much until we got tied up in our berth. I'm just going to stop talking for a minute and let you enjoy the sights and sounds of day 6 of our passage. It's much nicer to look at on the screen than it was to live through on the boat. Cindy's phrase of the day: centrifugal force day. Hang on! The last day of the trip was really disappointing. We were looking forward to an easing of the winds and an easing of the seas as we got closer to the coast, but instead the wind was as strong as ever, or even stronger. It was really an uncomfortable ride. Cindy summed up day 7 succinctly.
Don't even talk to me.
So now that we've seen what the passage looked like, let's look at the forecast on departure compared with the weather routing that I downloaded every day during the trip. I'll stretch and scale the departure routing so it matches the daily routings. It becomes obvious that there was very little change between the forecast on departure to the forecast on Friday. Let's do the same thing on day 4, Sunday. We can see here that the wind was forecast to be quite a bit higher at the end of the trip, up to about 20 knots from 15. And then on Thursday, day 6, again, the wind was pretty much at 20 knots or 18 to 20 through the whole rest of the trip. Let me tell you, that made a big difference. If we do the same thing with roll on departure and on Sunday, day 4, we can see that it got quite a bit worse. It's up to about 5 degrees now from 4. The graphs look a little skewed, but I've lined up the axes and the 4-degree mark so they match on both graphs. Here's Tuesday, day 6. When we departed, the roll was forecast to be about 4 degrees at the end of the trip, which was bad enough. Now we were getting forecasts where it was even in excess of 5 degrees, and it was really miserable. This is the first time we've had this kind of hydrodynamic forecasting on a passage, and I think this roll data was one of the most valuable tools we had. In the future, I'd like to say that maybe we wouldn't take a passage if the roll was in excess of, say, 3 degrees. 4 was certainly incredibly uncomfortable. That's if we had a choice, and here's why I say that. We say we don't sail on a schedule, but we do, in fact. And in this case, the schedule was that our visa was expiring in New Caledonia. And even now, weeks later after this passage, we still haven't seen anything suitable to get from New Caledonia to Australia. We really had no choice but to take this passage. I guess we could have gone to Vanuatu, but that was a whole different ball of wax. So while we leave you with some drone pictures of our beautiful port of arrival in Australia, Gladstone, I'd like to kind of summarize the lessons we've learned from this passage. This passage only looked marginal from the beginning and only got worse from there. Number 2, time pressure was the reason we took the passage. Our visas were expiring and we really had no other choice. If it hadn't been for the time pressure, we would have passed on this passage. Number 3, predict winds hydrodynamics are my new favorite tools, especially the roll. The comfort factor that I talked about in earlier episodes are good, but roll combines wave height, period, and direction in one number. This is my new go-to number. It's all about the water. That's number 4. We've come to believe that sea state is the key to a good passage and not just wind speed. So many cruisers don't even look at the waves when planning a passage, and that's really why we did this series. If we were going to ignore one factor, we might be better off ignoring the wind and just paying attention to sea state. Number 5, we might consider 3 degrees root mean squared roll to be our new maximum limit for any passage. I hope you've enjoyed this video series. I hope it'll help you have better passages yourself. Thank you so much for watching and happy sailing.